Welcome. It is so great to have you with us today.
Yeah, really excited to get into this one.
So if I asked you to just, point to Egypt on a mental map, you'd probably group it into that region we typically call the Middle East, right?
Right. I mean, that's what most of us are taught.
Exactly. But if you were looking at a medieval map from the 1300s, or if you actually zoomed all the way down to the literal tectonic plate the country sits on, you'd find Egypt firmly, deeply anchored in Africa.
Which is such a wild paradigm shift right out of the gate.
It really is. And that geographic reality is just the very first assumption we're going to challenge today. We're taking a deep dive into this massive, just incredibly eclectic stack of sources to uncover the cultural heartbeat of Egypt.
And we really do have a bit of everything today.
We do. We've got ancient DNA studies, medieval cartography, reports on the bustling modern nightlife of Cairo.
Deep analysis of Egyptian cinema, too.
Yes, and this fierce, ongoing battle over underground electronic music, which is just fascinating.
It's a phenomenal collection of data, honestly, because it forces us to look past the stereotypes. Yeah. It allows us to track this single, continuous cultural pulse over millennia.
Right.
And then we get to see how that pulse behaves when it hits the extreme pressures of the modern digital age.
Our mission for this deep dive is to discover exactly how an ancient culture survives, how it adapts, and most interestingly, how it occasionally clashes with itself in a modern era. We are really exploring that tension between incredibly deep-rooted traditions and the unstoppable chaotic force of modern street culture.
It's quite the collision.
It is, and just as a quick reminder before we really jump in, we have a strict rule for this exploration. We are keeping this discussion focused purely on history, geography, economics, and culture.
Absolutely.
We're absolutely not touching on modern politics, political figures, or regional political conflicts. We are here strictly for the culture and the data.
And to really understand that culture, to grasp the root of Egypt's modern clashes, we do have to start by completely redrawing those mental maps you mentioned earlier.
Right, the geography.
Yeah, we have to look at where Egypt physically and genetically sits. Because if you approach Egyptian culture expecting a purely Middle Eastern framework, you are going to misinterpret half of what you see.
Let's pull on that thread right away. Because when you dig into the historical sources, you hit this immediate realization that the label Middle East is actually a relatively modern geopolitical invention.
Completely modern, yeah.
It wasn't an organic cultural term used by the people living there for centuries. It was popularized around 1902 by a U.S. Navy strategist, this guy named Alfred Thayer Mahan.
Exactly. Mahan coined it for a very specific reason, which was naval and military strategy.
Okay.
He needed a shorthand to describe the geopolitical area between Arabia and India, primarily concerning British naval dominance in the Persian Gulf.
So it had nothing to do with the actual culture of the people?
Nothing at all. It was a strategic overlay imposed by outside powers, not some geographical or cultural truth born from the Nile Valley itself.
Which makes total sense why, if you look at how the world mapped itself before the 20th century, Egypt was universally understood to be African.
Right.
The sources point to the Hereford Mappamundi from the 1300s and the Africa Tabula Nova from the 1540s.
Those are incredibly important historical maps.
They really are, and they group the region firmly within the African continent. Even ancient Greek historians like Herodotus, who literally traveled there, documented the Egyptian people as native to the African continent.
And this isn't just a matter of old parchment, or where a cartographer decided to draw a line. It is a biological reality backed up by modern science.
Yeah, the tectonic plates.
Right, the land itself sits on the African tectonic plate. But more importantly, the genetic data shows a staggering level of continuity.
This was the part that blew my mind.
Oh, it's incredible. Recent genetic studies, including these highly detailed dental and cranial analyses from ancient burial sites like El Badari, demonstrate this perfectly.
I want to make sure we explain the mechanics of that because it's fascinating. When they do cranial and dental analysis, they aren't just looking at DNA fragments, right?
No, not just DNA.
They're looking at the morphological traits of the skulls. So like the shape of the jawbones, the specific wear patterns on the teeth, and they compare those ancient remains to the current population.
That's right. It's a way of tracking biological heritage through physical bone structure over thousands of years.
Oh.
And what anthropologists found is a direct, uninterrupted biological line. The people living along the Nile today share a profound, unbroken genetic link to the ancient populations of the Pharaonic era.
But I want to push back on that a little bit, or at least explore the paradox here.
Sure.
Because if you look at a timeline of Egypt, it is basically a highlight reel of foreign invasions.
Oh, definitely. It's constant.
You have the Greeks under Alexander, the Romans, the Ottomans, the French, the British. You have all these massive empires marching through the Nile Valley, planting their flags, and setting up ruling classes. How does a population absorb that many conquers without its core genetic and cultural makeup being completely overwritten?
It really comes down to the brutal, defining reality of geography. You have to picture the Nile Valley.
Okay.
It is this incredibly fertile, life-giving, but very narrow strip of green. And it is completely enclosed by harsh, unforgiving deserts to the east and the west.
So there's nowhere to go.
Exactly. That environment acted as an isolated incubator. Yes, the invasions happened. The official languages shifted from ancient Egyptian to Coptic to Arabic.
Sure.
The dominant religions shifted from polytheism to Christianity to Islam. But the core population, the millions of people whose labor was required to farm that specific land and navigate the annual flooding of the Nile, these stayed remarkably consistent.
So the ruling class at the top changes their clothes and their titles, but the underlying population has to keep doing the exact same things to survive the environment.
Precisely. The environment was so demanding that outsiders had to adapt to the Nile rather than the other way around.
Wow.
They never lost their foundational identity because the geography just wouldn't allow it.
That biological and geographic stability translates directly into what we could call a cultural muscle memory.
Oh, I like that term.
Yeah, it's not like a building where every generation comes in and redecorates the living room. It's more like a cultural operating system.
Okay, an operating system.
Yeah, the foundational code. You know, the agricultural rhythms, the basic diet, the way people express grief. That's version 1.0 from 5,000 years ago. The Greeks, the Ottomans, the modern elites, they're just installing new user interfaces on top of that same underlying system.
That is a phenomenal way to frame it. The operating system is still running today.
Yeah.
You see it in rural areas where ancient habits survive completely untouched. The sources detail how people still make sun-leavened bread the exact same way.
Thousands of years later.
Thousands of years. Or take buza, which is a traditional fermented drink. It's essentially a beer whose recipe fermenting lightly baked bread and water goes straight back to the Pharaohs.
That's amazing.
Even specific gestures of mourning at funerals today visually mirror the precise physical choreography carved into ancient tomb walls.
And that continuous thread of expressive movement flows directly into the performing arts.
It really does.
If we trace the earliest forms of Egyptian theater, they didn't start with people standing on a wooden stage reciting dialogue. They began in the Pharaonic era as massive, immersive religious ceremonies.
Or they were deeply physical.
They utilized music, specific wind instruments like flutes, stringed harps, and highly expressive, choreographed movement.
It was storytelling through physical performance, deeply tied to the spiritual life of the community. And as the centuries passed, that grassroots performance culture evolved, but it never lost its connection to the physical body and the rhythm of the streets.
Like traditional belly dance, for example.
Yes, take traditional belly dance. Over centuries, it evolved into a highly complex technical art form. It requires isolating specific muscle groups, utilizing fluid hip movements, incredibly intricate footwork, and often incorporating props like veils and swords.
And it wasn't hidden away in theaters either. It was a staple of massive public celebrations like weddings or street festivals like Moulid el-Nabi, which celebrates the Prophet's birthday, or the Nights of Ramadan.
It's everywhere.
Yeah, the culture was accessible, it was out in the open.
But then you get to the 19th century and the user interface gets a massive European-style update.
Right.
You have the Ottoman ruler, Ismail Pasha, and he has this grand sweeping vision. He wants to modernize his capital and make Cairo the Paris of the East.
The Paris of the East.
Exactly. So to coincide with the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869, he establishes the Cairo Opera House.
He literally builds a monument to high art to signal to European dignitaries that Egypt is a modern, cosmopolitan heavyweight.
It was a huge flex.
It really was. It wasn't just an architectural statement, it was a cultural one. He's inviting European troops, staging Verdi's Aida, and essentially creating a formalized, state-sponsored tier of entertainment that sits above the grassroots street festivals.
And for a long time, that top tier thrived. It set the stage for a local renaissance. In the 20th century, Egypt experienced a true golden age of theater and cinema.
They had legendary playwrights, brilliant actors,
And a rising middle class that had the disposable income to consume and support this art. The infrastructure grew, and Egypt became the undisputed shining entertainment capital of the Arab world.
You can still feel the echo of that prestige today. If you look at the modern glitz, the nightlife is legendary and highly curated.
Oh, absolutely.
You have incredible Nile dinner cruises where tourists and the wealthy watch Tenora spinning dancers. And just to give you some context, Tenora originates from Sufi whirling dervishes who spin in circles to represent the rotation of the universe and achieve spiritual trance.
But on the cruises.
On these cruises, it's adapted into a dazzling, neon-lit visual spectacle. You have sleek rooftop lounges in the Zamalek district overlooking the city, and the breezy, cafe-lined Corniche in Alexandria that comes alive at night.
The cinematic prestige remains deeply ingrained as well. Just recently, the Cairo International Film Festival partnered with international critics to name the top 25 Egyptian films of the 21st century.
And these aren't just local favorites.
No, these are complex masterworks.
The sources highlight films like the Nubian building, which is a perfect example. It's this sweeping narrative set in a single, historically grand apartment building in downtown Cairo.
It's such a brilliant concept.
It is. It uses the residents of this building to map out the extreme shifts in Egyptian society, from the old cosmopolitan elite to the struggles of the modern working class. It's brilliant filmmaking. But here is the friction we really have to address.
The economics.
Yes, that historic, prestigious infrastructure. The grand theaters, the print journalism, the high-end cinemas. The economic data in our sources shows that the upkeep on that cultural machine is becoming nearly impossible.
We have to look at the macroeconomic reality because it's hitting the cultural sector hard. In 2023, the Egyptian entertainment sector generated a massive $14.7 billion.
Wow.
Now, a large chunk of that was driven by tourism. But domestic cinema revenues alone were strong, hitting roughly 785 million Egyptian pounds.
That's significant.
It is. However, as we moved into 2024, the data shows a sharp, painful decline. Cinema revenues plummeted in the first third of the year.
And that's not because people suddenly stopped liking movies.
No, of course not.
It's because the macroeconomic levers, specifically inflation and the exchange rate of the US dollar, started crushing the domestic market.
Precisely. We have to explain how this works on a practical level. Take print journalism, which has historically been a pillar of Egyptian cultural discourse.
Right.
The industry is currently in a profound crisis. Why? Because the actual physical materials needed to print a newspaper, the high-quality paper and the specialized ink, are not produced domestically. They are imported.
And those imports are priced and paid for in US dollars. So when the local Egyptian currency devalues against the dollar, the cost of just getting ink on a page skyrockets. It doesn't matter how brilliant your journalists are or how many people want to read the stories. If the math of buying the ink breaks, the institution falters.
And that same economic squeeze hits the consumer directly when they try to access state-sponsored or high-end entertainment. As the cost of running these venues inflates, they pass that cost onto the ticket buyer.
It's a vicious cycle.
It is. The sources gave a striking example of this involving Omar Khayyat, who is a beloved, incredibly famous Egyptian musician.
Right.
In 2022, a ticket to see him perform at the Opera House cost around 460 Egyptian pounds. By 2024, just 2 years later, that exact same ticket jumped to over 1,700 pounds.
Think about that jump for a second. If you are an average citizen, your wages have not remotely kept pace with that kind of hyperinflation.
Not even close.
An evening out to see a legendary musician, which might have been a special treat a few years ago, suddenly becomes a completely impossible luxury. The film critic Zakaria, who is quoted in our sources, notes that entertainment is a basic human craving, especially during hard economic times.
People need an outlet.
They do, but the institutional venues are pricing them out. So if traditional state-sponsored entertainment is becoming too expensive for the average citizen, where does the culture go? People don't just stop needing to express themselves.
Which brings us to the most dynamic part of this deep dive. When the elite venues close their doors through pricing, the culture doesn't just stop. It doesn't give up.
No.
It goes underground. It goes online. And right now, that economic displacement has sparked a massive, fascinating clash between the working class streets and the cultural gatekeepers.
This is where we have to talk about Maraganat. I am so fascinated by the mechanics of this movement. Maraganat translates to festivals, and it is a wildly energetic, underground electronic genre. It wasn't born in the pristine acoustics of the Opera House. It was born in Cairo's poorer working-class neighborhoods, like Madinat al-Salam.
To understand Maraganat, you first have to understand Sha'abi music. Shabi translates roughly to of the people.
Okay.
It has always been the acoustic, driving, rhythmic sound of the working class streets, typically played at neighborhood weddings. What Margaret artists did was take that organic Shabi rhythm and supercharge it for the digital age.
Right, because they didn't have access to expensive recording studios or professional orchestras.
Exactly.
So wedding DJs started using cheap, often pirated production software. They took those traditional beats, mixed them with heavy, synthesized electronic drum machines, and bathed the vocals in auto-tune. The result is loud, it's frantic, and it's incredibly infectious.
And critically, the lyrical content is a drastic departure from the refined, poetic, classical Arabic favored by the state institution.
Oh,
Moraganat artists tackle real, gritty, everyday street issues. They sing about unemployment, about heartbreaks, about the raw struggle to survive in the city. They use heavy street slang. It is unfiltered reality.
Which is exactly why it caused an absolute panic among the cultural authorities. The Egyptian Musicians Syndicate is this powerful official gatekeeper of culture. They're led by Honey Shaker, who is a very famous traditional classical singer.
Very traditional.
And the syndicate essentially went to war with Marganat.
They viewed it not as an evolution of culture, but as an active threat to it. The syndicate issued a decree banning Marganat artists from performing in any tourist areas, high-end clubs, or those fancy Nile dinner cruises we talked about.
They completely shut them out.
They officially labeled the music vulgar, arguing that it relied too heavily on slang and sexual innuendos, and that it degraded the authentic, refined Egyptian identity.
The major flashpoint for this clash involved a massive hit song by an artist named Hassan Shakosh. The song is called Bent El Guran, which means the neighbor's daughter.
You'd saw
Massive. Shakosh performed it at a massive stadium concert for Valentine's Day. And if you look at the lyrics, he's singing about being so heartbroken over a girl that he's going to turn to drinking alcohol and smoking hash.
And to the syndicate, hearing those specific lyrics blasted in a massive stadium was crossing a red line. They viewed it as a degradation of public morals.
Right.
But what's fascinating is how they responded. They didn't just write angry op-eds. They utilized their economic power to enact a total ban on these artists in physical venues.
But here's where the syndicate's strategy completely backfired and where the 21st century really asserts itself. Historically, the syndicate relies on licensing fees from artists to survive.
Right, the paperwork.
They use those licenses to control who gets to step on a stage and earn a living. If they ban you, your career is over. But Marganat artists don't need the physical stage.
They found a digital loophole.
Exactly. They distribute their music directly to the listener via YouTube and SoundCloud. They completely bypass the institutional gatekeepers. And the numbers they are pulling are astronomical.
Oh, the numbers are unbelievable.
That song we just mentioned, Ben El Guran, it racked up hundreds of millions of views. The sources estimate that Hassan Shakosh made around $739,600 in a single month just from YouTube monetization.
Over $700,000 in a month.
It's staggering. And then you have figures like Mohammed Ramadan, who is this massive actor and Marganat singer, pulling in millions of dollars.
If you step back and look at the broader implications, this isn't just a debate about musical taste or whether a song's lyrics are polite enough for a dinner cruise.
You know.
It's a battle over social mobility and who gets to define culture. It is strikingly similar to the moral panic we saw in Egypt in the 1980s over cassette tapes.
Oh, that's a great comparison, because back then, cheap cassette recorders allowed anyone to record and distribute music without state studio approval.
Exactly. And the cultural critics back then used the exact same language. They called cassette culture vulgar and warned of a tarnishing of public taste. Today, history is repeating itself, just upgrading from a dual-deck cassette recorder to a smartphone and an internet connection.
It's the ultimate democratization of the culture. The state, with its classical Arabic and its 1,700-pound opera house tickets, wants to maintain the curated user interface.
Right.
But the working-class youth, facing massive economic hurdles, found a digital backdoor to achieve incredible upward social mobility. The syndicate can lock them out of the physical clubs, but they absolutely cannot lock them out of the internet.
Which brings us back to where we started. We set out to understand how a culture survives for 5 millennia. We looked at the tectonic plates, the genetic continuity, the unbreakable agricultural rhythms of the Nile.
Right.
What this Marganat class shows us is that the operating system survives not by remaining static behind glass, but by constantly reinventing its output on the streets.
It leaves you with a really profound thought to consider. We spend so much time looking at the official gatekeepers, the museums, the state theaters, the syndicates, assuming they are the ones keeping a culture alive.
Right.
But if you look at the actual data, perhaps the true guardians of a nation's identity aren't its institutions at all. Perhaps the real guardians are its algorithms, its youth, and its underground beats.
A culture that adapts is a culture that survives.
Absolutely. It completely changes how you look at a map and how you listen to that trending audio on your phone.
Thanks so much for exploring with us today. Until next time, goodbye.